There's a ridiculous debate going on at the moment as to the risks of 5G and whether or not governments are using the COVID-19 pandemic to sneak through legislation that speeds through the installation or upgrades of cell towers despite the risk, or even that COVID-19 was caused by 5G. I covered why this is a silly argument in a previous video, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about it again. But on the topic of sneaking things through, there is something going on in the US Congress during the global pandemic. It's called the Earn-It Act, and you may or may not have heard of it. In this video, I'll inform you of what the Earn-It Act is and why it's potentially dangerous. In this case, Earn-It Act actually stands for something, the Eliminating Abusive and Rampant Neglect of Interactive Technologies Act. And what is it proposed to do? Well, in the US, there's something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It states that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. The statement is sometimes referred to as the 26 words that created the internet. What Section 230 means is that by default, any computer-based service provider, whether it be the ISP or some sort of social media, will be exempt from liability for content uploaded by a third party. So, for example, the case of Carafano versus Metrosplash.com, whereby a user on a dating website uploaded a fake profile and an individual who was duped by the fraudster tried to sue the website. Section 230 exempts websites or digital service providers from liability on the grounds that they cannot be held responsible for what a third party does with their service. Now, there is some moral imperative for service providers to clamp down on certain things, like exchanging porn on Twitter, but there's no legal imperative for them to do so. Essentially, service providers cannot be blamed for what users do on their platform. The European Union enshrines similar rights to service providers with Directive 2031/EC. The Earn-It Act would aim to force service providers to earn their exemption under Section 230, rather than being exempt by default. Now, you may already be able to see what is so damaging about the Earn-It Act. Companies would suddenly be liable for illegal content posted by third parties on their platform. For example, if someone were exchanging child porn on Twitter, which has happened. Now, of course, exchanging images of this nature is both morally reprehensible and illegal, but how is it Twitter's fault that some nonces are engaging in this activity? How could the creators of Twitter have foreseen that their platform would be abused in such a way? Surely it's those users that are in the wrong and not Twitter. Well, Section 230 made that legally the case, but the Earn-It Act threatens to undo all of this. The Act is being endorsed by those who believe the government's tale that it will help to reduce sex crimes and child abuse circulating on the internet, but this is not the case. A previous bill that Congress passed, the Foster-Sester Bill, led to Craigslist removing their online personal section. That, in turn, led to prostitutes being driven back into the hands of pimps, and in San Francisco alone, prostitution-related crime and violence against sex workers actually tripled. But there is a much more dangerous aspect to the Earn-It Act that we should all be very wary of. Currently, messaging services such as WhatsApp utilize something called end-to-end encryption. For those of you that aren't familiar with this process, it basically secures your chats both on your end and the end of the person you're communicating with. This is done with encryption keys, and WhatsApp doesn't even have access to the key to decrypt your messages. The messages aren't stored and then encrypted by WhatsApp, but they are encrypted on your end and your friend's end before the messages are even stored. This prevents eavesdroppers from being able to gain access to the keys required to decrypt your conversation. Now, this doesn't always work for a variety of reasons. In 2013, Edward Snowden famously blew the whistle on Microsoft introducing a backdoor into Skype, allowing Microsoft to hand over conversations and messages to the NSA despite end-to-end encryption. One of the Earn-It Act's co-sponsors, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, has gone on record as saying that they refuse to allow abuse to continue in the name of any other freedom, and it is not written out of the bill that end-to-end encryption will be done away with, or whether law enforcement will have access to a built-in backdoor. Graham cites Facebook as a major culprit, and of course, Facebook owns WhatsApp. This backdoor is something US lawmakers have wanted to inflict on tech companies for years now. Let's not pretend that this is anything at all to do with protecting children. This line is just another way to advertise something the US government have been trying to do since 9/11. In fact, weakening encryption is not a real solution at all to child online exploitation. It simply treats everyone with a private digital life as a suspect, or that they're up to something. You see, nowadays, the internet and its services are so deeply entrenched into our lives that the digital world is almost like a second home. You have a right to privacy in your actual home, but a right to privacy in your virtual home is something that is constantly under attack from lawmakers. This is yet another attempt to undermine our right to privacy and free speech online. Now, you might think that this is a US thing and as such will only affect US citizens, but that's where you're wrong. This bill is aimed at US companies, not individuals. Therefore, Facebook, who owns WhatsApp, would be forced to cooperate with the bill. Weakening or doing away with end-to-end encryption would affect any user of WhatsApp the world over. But what's more, if a backdoor were installed, this could potentially be exploited by any hacker, regardless of nationality. So you see, it doesn't matter where you're from, the Earn It Act affects all of us who value free speech and privacy online. Now, whilst the world is focused on the global pandemic, we're obviously concerned with death rates, keeping safe and staying in touch with each other. However, imagine if those sensitive conversations you're having with friends and family over WhatsApp to check on how they're doing could be eavesdropped on by law enforcement, just to check if you're a law-abiding citizen. I imagine this prospect scares you somewhat. If it doesn't, you may subscribe to the argument that you have nothing to hide, but this argument doesn't hold any weight. Edward Snowden famously stated that arguing that you don't care about the right to privacy because you have nothing to hide is no different from saying you don't care about free speech because you have nothing to say. Also, if you think back to my analogy comparing your online life to a second home, well, you wouldn't like it if law enforcement consistently walked into your house using a skeleton key to check if you're doing anything illegal. So why would you accept law enforcement helping themselves to your private conversations online? It's not that you have something to hide, it's that you have a right to a private life. If that doesn't convince you, so be it. But just keep in mind that the internet privacy is a safe haven for free speech in countries with strict censorship laws. Imagine the government leaking information about you because you're associated with a whistleblower. All in all, this act needs to be stopped in its tracks. But whilst we're all understandably preoccupied with the COVID-19 outbreak, something is going on which we all ought to be aware of.